So it's been a great morning of panels, and I think the real running thread is that everyone here who has spoken has a real vested interest and are probably fans of electric vehicles. But that's certainly not a sentiment that's shared by large swaths of the country, and views on EVs increasingly seem to be breaking down on partisan lines. There was a Gallup poll last year that found that 61% of Democrats were considering buying an EV in the future, but just 24% of Republicans were. And EV registration data shows a massive gulf between blue states and counties, like here in Los Angeles, and red ones. We heard about some of this in our first panel discussion today on EV adoption in the heartland. So bottom line is, this political polarization problem is real for the EV industry. So Mike, I want to start with you. You recently founded a campaign called the EV Politics Project, and with the mission to combat what you call EV bashing in the 2024 election, and to reframe the idea of EVs for Republicans, which of course you are one yourself. And you started out this campaign by conducting some of your own polling, which I want to talk about. I thought that one of the most striking results that you found was a massive divide between Democrats and Republicans who agreed with the statement, EVs are for people who see the world differently than I do. So can you talk a little bit more about what you found in the polling and what your organization set out to do?
Yes, excellent, and thank you all for having me here. I grew up around the car business in Detroit. I'm a motorhead. My lifelong average is 4 miles per gallon. But I became an EV nut a couple years ago, and it frustrated me that so many Republicans were trashing them. So being a political consultant, took some polling like a campaign would. And that's exactly right, James. What has happened is tribalism, which rules our politics, has now infected vehicle choice, which is very new. I was briefing one of the OEM CEOs with our data who said, we spend millions and millions on market research. We never asked anybody if they're a Republican or a Democrat. We're in a whole new world here. And what we found was the positive attributes line up between the parties really well. Don't pay for gas, fast, fun to drive, quiet. But when you get to environmental policy, that's a trigger, and then it's politics. Only about 58% of the people we surveyed, which is about 2/3 of the electorate, and we started at 50,000 a year and up because we wanted to get to the new car market. About 60% said climate change is really important and EVs are good for it. 40% approximately said climate change is way overhyped, not interested, EV, they just immediately go to their sides. And it's in the way. So all the great early adopter marketing with the white polar bears and the green leafs and everything, worked then, but it's defined these things as dogma vehicles in a politics that's become incredibly partisan, take a side, one team versus the other. And the mandates don't help because that becomes a scary thing in a campaign environment. So the bottom line is what we found. There's a lot to do to fix the marketing. The core attributes are really good. And our work is focused on the swing states that will pick the president, particularly Michigan and Georgia, which are full of EV manufacturing jobs nobody knows about. So we're raising money on a bipartisan basis to tell that story, not talk about candidates, but make those jobs famous. And try to change the incentive set for the politicians. And there are good hints. The Republican governor of Georgia, who knows he's won the lottery on new jobs, you don't see him trashing EVs. So we want that fever to catch on and kind of change the incentives of the election. The final thing I'll say is, if you look at the Biden administration goals of 2023, you cannot get there with Democrats. There aren't enough, and independents. Republicans are about 40% of the electorate over 50,000 a year, new car buyers. If you don't get them, you need every Democrat to own 129% EV to get to the standards. So it's uphill, but we're enjoying the good fight here, and I think we've got arguments to make.
That's really helpful to frame this discussion. I think this dividing line on climate sentiments is really striking. Lynda, you've served in both the Biden and Obama administrations, and which both made climate change a really central part of their pitch for EVs. So do you think this sort of green lens on EVs has hit a ceiling in some ways?
Thank you, James. I don't actually think there's a ceiling, but I do think that, to Mike's point, the messaging really matters. And during the Obama years, it wasn't so much that we were talking about electric vehicles, we were talking about corporate average fuel economy. And we made a very deliberate choice to talk about the pocketbook and how that was going to impact consumers' bottom line on a regular basis. If your car can go farther on fewer gallons of fuel, then that's obviously going to help you and what you're able to do in terms of household income. Similarly, on the electric vehicle front, I think that, and I think your research bears this out, Mike, we really need to focus on the economics of it, right? You're going to save people money if they're not going to a gas station. You're going to save people in terms of convenience if they're able to plug in at home. So I do think that the framing matters, and for the folks that are diehards, maybe they call themselves EV nuts too, Mike, those people who really, really care about those polar bears, I think you continue with that messaging. But broadly, it's always about the economy.
All I'd say quickly, what we learned is if you're concerned about the environment and climate change, you already want an EV. Your barrier is price and charging, so marginal marketing money there, in my view as a marketer, is wasted money in the advertising and marketing side.
And Mike, you mentioned this concern about the way that, I think some of the disdain for EVs among conservatives comes from the feeling that they're being pushed down their throats by government regulation. And I think this is a really good place to bring in Tim, who has looked at this in his research. So, how do we avoid EVs becoming just Biden mobiles?
Yeah, so I mean, affective polarization is a very real thing. It isn't just that people are choosing products because they work for them. Sometimes they're choosing them because of which side they're perceived to be on or which side they're not to be perceived on. Like, in fact, Elon Musk is an interesting case of someone who has become, I think, a more polarizing partisan figure, which seems to be leading potentially more Republicans to consider buying Teslas or Cybertrucks than they used to. But I think that's outweighed by how many early adopter Democrats have been actively pushed away by being associated with that. So, I mean, there is a double-edged sword of any sort of policy that's associated with a particular party that is leading to incentives. In some cases, it might drive adoption, but it also is identified with that party and might actively alienate people on the other side. The sort of friend of my enemy is my enemy kind of situation that I think people need to be very cautious about politicizing or Bud Lighting their product.
Yeah, I don't know if the camera can see this, but it's my favorite. It's the Elon chart in our data. The blue are Democrats. Only a third of them think Elon Musk is a good ambassador for EVs. The Republicans, who are much more EV skeptic, love Elon Musk. He's turned into Hannity. And you can see it in the Tesla sales figures over the last 12 months.
So, Lynda, I want to ask if you think that, in terms of the way that EVs are marketed going forward, and particularly where the government comes in here, how do you think the Biden administration needs to, or do you think the Biden administration needs to shift the way it promotes EVs at all to avoid further contributing to this polarization?
Well, what we often talked about during my time in the administration, James, was dealing with consumer acceptance, and in particular, this concept of range anxiety. And so a lot of the messaging that you see from the administration is about making people feel comfortable that they can have this cross-country road trip and not worry about where they're going to charge up their vehicle. I don't think that piece of it's going to change. I do also think that, back to our earlier point about the economics of all of this, Government often gets a bad rap, especially in a room full of industry, but government's role here is to make sure we have a national charging network. It's why this administration has pushed $7.5 billion into states all across the country. It's why the administration just put out $1.3 billion in opportunities for charging and fueling infrastructure grants in communities along corridors just yesterday, right? That's the role of government, is to make everybody feel a little bit more comfortable, and also maybe drive home the point that, yeah, you want to have a vehicle that goes 500 miles in a single charge, but actually most people go no more than 12 miles a day, right? So you can have an electric vehicle, you can have an incredible experience, and that's part of the messaging the administration needs to keep hyping.
If I could jump in there, I think also there's an opportunity to use things like plug-in hybrids and hybrids to build acceptance for people who might be EV skeptic for, in some cases, range anxiety reasons or other ways as well. Pew Research did a study last year that showed that current EV or hybrid buyers were much more likely, twice as likely, to consider buying another one in the future. I think you can view plug-in hybrids as sort of a gateway drug that don't have the negative associations among Republicans potentially, compared to something that gives them a better experience for the environment without necessarily being attributed as such.
Just quickly on charging, because I'm a big fan of the federal investment, but I come from politics, work for a lot of governors, including Schwarzenegger here. When you pour the money to the states, set a very slow clock to ever see anything happen. We're only in the double digits, low double digits of actual fast charging stations that have been deployed, and the fast charging companies are all going crazy. And what our polling tells us, the biggest pain point is not just long distance trips, it's I'm a yuppie, I make good money, I want to buy a beautiful Mustang Mach-E, but I'm in a $1 million condo outside Chicago and I can't have level 2 charging. It's the multifamily thing that is as big of a problem, but it doesn't get a lot of attention because retrofitting is expensive. But that is, they're screaming it in the data, which surprised me.
Right, but that's, of course, part of what we thought about as we're designing the program. So $5 billion of the $7.5 went to the states, the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program. But another $2.5 billion was very intentionally meant to be in communities specifically because of this issue, right? We want to make sure that we are accommodating multifamily housing and also making people feel like it's right there and convenient for them. I mean, I guess part of what needs to happen is obviously supercharging, if I could be a little bit of pun here, the actual execution of these dollars and the building of these charging stations. But at the same time, it's the federal government, to your point, Mike, and some things take time. If we had dumped all this money into the streets and suddenly things were just going up here and there, I actually think the opposite would have happened in terms of criticism. Why isn't there more accountability? Why isn't there more sort of checking and planning? So it's, there's the urgency of pushing the money out and getting the work done, but also an understanding that, change is hard, change takes time.
So many of those, here in this room are responsible for selling or marketing EVs. And so I want to turn now to some solutions or takeaways that they might want to take from this discussion. And Mike, you mentioned earlier about how, simply, I think this was a line that I liked from your reporting and the polling. Simply telling Republicans that they're full of it is not a path to widespread adoption.
I like to do that myself.
Yeah. So, you're missing 40 to 50% of the car market. So, I want to go quickly to each of you, and what is your biggest takeaway on how those of us in the industry, or those of you out here in the industry, can temper this polarization, especially as we head into, especially as the election season ramps up this year?
Well, beyond the no more white polar bears, the biggest thing I've learned, and it's fun, I've been on the auto CEO tour because they're eating this stuff up. And coming from politics, I have a different point of view on those voters. Secretary Buttigieg has been a huge supporter too because he's a Paul. Here's the secret finding. And I told one of the auto CEOs, I would cut $100 million of marketing spend to put $30 million of weekend test drive cars out there in the right dealerships. Because in our polling, on every question we ask people of their opinion about an EV, we cross-tabbed it with another question. Do you have friends or relatives who own and drive an EV? If they said yes to this question, they're running 15 to 30 points better on every question. The real myth buster thing here is not an hour. Give it to them for a weekend. Burn some inventory into the used category. You'll get a 4-to-1 return on that spend over what regular marketing would do for you. Using them shatters the myth, because when you use them, you learn the attributes. The myth stuff is what works on YouTube and social media. You punch through that when people live with the car for 48 hours. That is key. And the dealers have to, there are some very successful dealers, but not many in the EV space in the legacy brands. And what they'll all tell you is, we make our salespeople drive them for a week, whether they want to or not. That's how you make converts. So anyway, it's the experience stuff. That's why this event is so great, by the way. And I'm hoping you have huge foot traffic tomorrow.
Tim?
I think that was all great, and I agree with basically all of it. One thing I would say, though, as a caution, is that people's attitudes, especially on political issues, take a while to change and update. So even if the polar bears go away tomorrow, people still, I think, will have that association in their heads for a while. I agree completely that demonizing something you have no experience with is a lot easier than something that you have contact with. And again, I do think that as time has passed, for instance, it seems kind of strange to think back, oh, a Toyota Prius used to be associated with, you know, celebrities in Hollywood going to the Oscars and that kind of thing, that now is basically gone. Like, enough time has passed that that association is gone. And I think you can count on that same sort of process if people do have day-to-day experience with hybrids, with plug-in hybrids, and also with electrics, that their attitudes will change. That said, I mean, a lot of the people who are having these messages or policies pushed at them have objective circumstances that aren't a great fit, because they don't have home charging, they don't have potentially some of the range issues, maybe need to tow something. So all those cases, maybe another message I would suggest is to think about the notion of somebody who already has a combustion car for one car, having their second car be a way, you know, the grocery getter, the sort of, and then they can work from that experience as well. I think, you know, gradual stages instead of mandates that push people against their will, I think might be more effective at reducing political tensions on the issue.
Yeah, the one thing I would add is that a lot of the opposition messaging that I've heard has been around things like threatening auto worker jobs, and this is going to be a jobs killer. I mean, there's a reason why. You heard Mike talk earlier about Georgia. South Carolina and Georgia are constantly brawling over how they get industry to come and invest in their states. Why? Because it's a job creator. So I really do think that we need to flip the script on that piece of it in particular.
Yeah, definitely. That's another way that, you know, we talk about people getting exposed to EVs through a weekend test drive, but also you may be exposed to EVs because you or your family member works in a facility that manufactures them. You know, one of the big concerns that I think has been particularly among conservatives on EVs is about China, and you know, the concern that moving towards EVs more quickly could benefit China. So, you know, how do you respond to that concern? And, you know, is that something that you, you know, maybe we'll start with you, Lynda, you know, from the administration perspective, you know, how do you tackle that concern?
I'm so glad you asked this question, James, because I think it's actually the opposite. So China is moving forward on electrification no matter what we do here. And if we don't get in the game, stay in the game, push really hard to compete in the global arena, we're just going to be left behind. So I actually think that's the argument. I'm interested in what Mike's research showed about how compelling that is, especially to folks that are generally opposed. I mean, there's a reason why in a lot of the new pitches and programs in the administration, you hear discussion about American competitiveness because it's real, right? Our shores don't stop the competition, right? We need to be in the game.
Yeah, if you look at the Chinese success entering other markets, particularly Latin America, it's like a sci-fi movie. It is unbelievable. They're taking over everything. And there are credible studies that say they will have 75% of world, including this market, which is only 10% of the world, 75% of auto manufacturing in about 15 years at the current rate, which is one reason I'm doing this, because I hate the idea that we're fighting ourselves. Most of the problem is when you get to the polling, so all the smart people in the administration and even in the Republican leadership kind of get this. They don't talk about it in the Republican leadership because we're going through a very odd period now. But it's out there. The problem is, I lived through the Japanese invasion of the U.S. auto market in the 70s. I was a kid growing up in Detroit, people I knew, relatives, friends, dads, getting laid off. The Detroit mentality before was people are never going to buy an Asian car. Well, here's what everybody from Sam Walton on down will teach you about the American consumer. If you can beat on price and the quality is okay or better, you win. So there's no doubt that they could come in with a $20,000 EV and we'd be closing North American auto plants. So I'm a free trader. I'm a conservative Republican. I don't like the tariffs, but we need the time out because their industry is heavily subsidized. And I hear in the EV world sometimes, no, I want to be able to buy a great $18,000 EV. And from a consumer point of view, there's an argument for that. That's why Walmart will sell you a $4 rake and try to find a rake factory in America. But this is not Japanese competition. They're an ally. Germany's an ally. This is a geopolitical rival, potential opponent. One of the auto execs told me, yeah, if this keeps up and we screw up, in 15 years when the Pentagon calls me for 2,000 tanks, I'm going to tell them to call Shanghai. So it's a real thing, but it's not a real thing in voter land. And we have to be careful on banking on USA #1, because if they come in on price, American consumer is wallet driven.
Right, and the more EVs that are built in America, the more you alleviate those concerns
Exactly.
about Chinese materials. So in our last couple minutes here, I just want to turn back to Tim. You know, your research is broad in terms of political polarization. You know, what should be our biggest takeaway about how that research applies in the EV sector?
One thing I would say is a tempting solution that I want to caution people away from is to try to micro-target specific messages to Democrats and Republicans separately, because frankly there is an entrepreneurial market out there of anger merchants that will find your message and shop it to the other side for attention and such. So micro-targeting, I think, works in less politicized areas, but the more politicized the area is, the more likely it is that your micro-targeted message will become macro-targeted before you realize it. And there is a very large potential for backlash, as you know, I think, of course, Bud Light is a case that's made it very clear when a company gets too closely associated with something that alienates part of their core audience. So I would just say, in terms of marketing ideas, you probably should focus on what is beneficial to the consumer at an objective standpoint, and maybe now is the time to step a little bit away from more sort of aspirational or I'll just say you don't actually appeal to an atheist by saying Jesus wants you to do this. I think that is the case when you're appealing to conservatives on the environment sometimes. Okay.
Well, that's a great way to wrap up here. I just want to throw one more stat at the audience from Mike's polling. One of the more optimistic findings, I think, was that 56% of all the voters who responded, including 44% of the Republicans, agreed that EVs are the future and one day I'll probably drive one. So I think that the takeaway is there's some real challenges ahead, but there is a clear path forward to making EVs the future for everyone.
Yeah,
so thanks, everyone.
Just real quick, there's so many green shoots. If you want the polling, we've released it. Go to evpolitics.org, evpolitics.org, and you can get a cool bumper sticker.
All right, well, thank you, everyone, and enjoy the expo.